Allow me to welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you all very, very much for coming to another fabulous Dumanian lecture in the Dumanian Lecture Series. The Department of Middle Eastern Studies, as ever, feels very fortunate to have had the support over many years of Mrs. Edma Dumanian in underwriting both these public lectures and also the visiting professorship that we have usually in the spring quarter. And so, as you know, it's not pro forma. It's a genuine thank you to her and to her family for their ongoing support of what is a valuable program for us. We have tonight's lecture is part of the Dumanian Lecture Series, but is a lecture by the current visiting professor, Kent Scholl. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Hrypsime Haritunian, who is genuinely the heart and soul of Armenian studies at the University of Chicago.
Thank you, Holly.
It's nice to be the solid hearts. Thank you. So it's my pleasure today to introduce today's our speaker. I see some students arrived, coming. We have Kent Scholl, Professor Kent Scholl, who is an associate professor of Ottoman and Middle East history and director of both the Center of Middle East and North Africa Studies and the Ottoman Demographic, Social and Family History Research Group at Binghamton University, University, State University, New York. He's also the Dumanian visiting professor this year in this quarter at the University of Chicago, and we are very happy to have him. His publications include Missionary to the Middle East, the Journals of Joseph Wilford Booth, that was co-authored with James Toronto, that came out in 2024. Then Prisons in the Late Ottoman Empire, Microcosm of Modernity, that came out from Edinburgh University Press in 2014, and 3 co-edited volumes. He's currently book series editor for Edinburgh Studies on the Ottoman Empire and the former editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. His research interests include the social and cultural history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Middle East, criminal justice, missiology, Armenians in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman Middle East, and forced migration in the Middle Eastern and North Africa region. So let's welcome our speaker of today, Kent Scholl.
Thank you. Hrypsime, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for being such a lovely host here. Also to Holly for making this possible, and I also sincerely want to thank the Dumanian family for their generous support here. Thanks. There's some familiar faces in the audience and some new ones, and so it's wonderful to be here. This is actually my first time at the University of Chicago, so this is a good experience for me as well, being here this quarter. I'm going to get rid of the. Excuse me. I'm going to get rid of the. I'll bring up my PowerPoint here, and we'll go through this. So, this is a relatively new topic for me. It's very far departed from my original works on law and status, criminal justice in the Ottoman Empire, late Ottoman Empire, my first book on prisons, as was mentioned. But it does intersect it quite a bit in a lot of different ways because of the nature of the Armenian status of Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire. I stumbled into this topic because of my co-author, James Toronto, wrote me into this several years ago. I was invited to give a talk at Brigham Young University, where he's a professor of Islamic studies there and Arabic, and to talk about the World War I and the creation of the modern Middle East. The journals of the missionaries like Joseph Booth, who spent 17 years in the late Ottoman and post-Ottoman Middle East, 17 years over a period of 30 years from 1898 until 1928. And he kept a daily journal. And in that journal, Jim Toronto and I transcribed it with the wonderful support of many research assistants, and we published a synopsis or thematic selections of it because it's 1,200 pages, 600,000 words. It is incredibly detailed information about this time and place. Somebody who learned the languages at the time. And it got me very interested in actually who the converts were. We're talking about a small group, not a large group of Armenians who converted, no more than 300 at any one time in the Ottoman Empire. But through this micro history, we get to see a lot of global issues going on, and Ottoman and also U.S. issues. So this is one of these weird talks that actually brings two peripheries of two different empires together. Utah of the United States in the late 19th century, right? And the Mormon communities there, and then the Armenian communities of central Anatolia and what's today northern Syria. So it's through immigration, through proselyting, through missionary work, through Ottoman legal practices, persecution, but also the local Armenian populations as well, and how this integrates into, how this gives us insight into the broader issues of the late Ottoman period, particularly as regarding non-Muslims, their legal status. So I still get to deal with law on some level here. But it's also just, for me, it's an interesting window into a lot of broader issues of the late Ottoman and post-Ottoman Middle East. So today I'm going to be talking about the conversion, the persecution, and immigration of the Mormon-Armenian communities. So missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons, or LDS, I'll be using those terminologies interchangeably here, began systematically proselyting in the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s and continued their efforts in the Middle East well past the empire's demise, working primarily among Armenian communities within the central Anatolian corridor, basically what I call from Samsun, here it is, from Samsun down. These are different cities where people converted to Mormonism during the late Ottoman period, but they had four primary centers. In Zara, in the province of Sivas, today in Turkey, Aintab or Gaziantep today, Marash, and Aleppo, Haleb in northern Syria today. Those were the four main congregations, four main areas of proselyting work. But like many Western missionaries that came to the Ottoman Empire, there was always this desire for, I don't know, I call it missio tourism. They all had to go to the Holy Land at some point, right? You didn't come all the way this way to the Middle East and not go down to the Holy Land. So there's all these great pictures that survive you'll see some of them today of Mormon missionaries, but other Western missionaries wearing the fez, posing in front of like the dome, if they can get to the Dome of the Rock or the Wailing Wall, or being around basically the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or those other places in Jerusalem in particular. But these were important spaces for them. And though small in number, as I said, the LDS Armenian population never totaled more than 300 at any one time. The LDS Armenian population of the late Ottoman period provides interesting insights into larger phenomena of the era, including Western interventionism and missionary work, Ottoman administrative and legal transformations, the status of marginalized communities, particularly non-Muslims, mass atrocity and genocide, and the Armenian immigration to the United States. Over the course of the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, tens of thousands of Armenians immigrated to the United States from the Ottoman Empire. Among those were approximately 100 LDS Armenians, Mormon Armenians, who immigrated from the four areas I just mentioned, Zara, Marash, Aintab, and Aleppo. While scholars identify two main waves of Armenian immigration to the United States prior to World War I, divided by the immediate aftermath of the Hamidian massacres in 1894 to 96 in eastern Anatolia, central Anatolia, and then after the 1909 Adana massacres, they periodize it before World War I in those two ways, most scholars. But also economic opportunities were a major draw for Ottoman Armenians, particularly the United States from the 1880s onwards, as demonstrated in David Gutman's wonderful book on this topic about the trans-hemispheric migrations of Ottoman Armenians coming out of the empire, going to North America, and then coming back. and their experiences. But unlike other Armenian immigrants of the era, Mormon Armenians could not utilize the human smuggling networks common among the broader Ottoman Armenian community in order to bypass Ottoman mobility restrictions imposed upon them. This is partially because of the prejudice and discrimination the Mormon Armenians experienced at the hands of the broader Armenian community. LDS Armenians also did not participate in widespread trans-hemispheric migrations, as I just mentioned, notwithstanding being subject to the same travel restrictions and discriminations leveled against the entire Ottoman Armenian population at the time. Additionally, LDS Armenian immigration experiences were affected by broader Mormon immigration practices and the unique immigration restrictions placed by the United States on Mormon immigration to America, such as the 1887 Edmunds-Tucker Act and the 1891 Immigration Act. I'll go into those in a little more detail. These restrictions, when compounded with the anti-Armenian immigration practices imposed by the Ottoman Empire, caused unique immigration challenges for LDS Armenians above those already in place for Armenians and Asian immigrants to the United States at the time. Based upon the Ottoman and LDS Church official documents and the diaries and memoirs of Mormon missionaries and local LDS Armenians, this talk investigates the challenges faced by LDS Armenians as they attempted to immigrate to the United States. Their mobility was extremely limited due to severe intersecting reasons. Most important among them was their dual status as Mormon and Armenians, which subjected them to both United States and Ottoman immigration restrictions aimed at combating the spread of polygamy within the United States and to prevent Asian immigration to the United States at the same time. And also, from the Ottoman perspective, to prevent, in their view, the radicalization of Armenians against Ottoman rule. Notwithstanding the promises made by the Ottoman Tanzimat decrees and the U.S. Bill of Rights, the Mormon Armenian religious freedoms that were actively, the Mormons and their Armenian converts faced severe limitations on their religious freedoms that were actively supported by U.S. and Ottoman state officials, not to mention the broader societies of both states. So I think it's really important to take a look at the status of Mormons and Armenian converts in the late Ottoman Empire is best understood within a framework of what I call compounding legal marginalization at the international, imperial, and local levels. As I'd already mentioned, Mormons were extremely marginalized in the United States as a distinct religious community, known for their controversial religious practices and beliefs, especially polygamy. Mormon missionaries were marginalized by other Western missionaries, local Christian clergies, and by the Ottoman administration. Armenians were marginalized ethno-religious community in the late Ottoman Empire, and Mormon Armenians were doubly marginalized by the broader Armenian community and the Ottoman state together. These intersecting degrees of compounding marginality greatly affected the LDS Armenians community's ability to gain legal recognition. They actually the Mormons applied for millet status in the late Ottoman Empire and were denied that. The severe limitations to practice their faith, move about the empire, and immigrate, especially to the United States. So, I want to just give a really brief overview of some of the Mormon missionary activities. But I want to start off, this is an encapsulating quote. This was written by Joseph Booth and published just a couple months before his death in December of 1928. He died of cardiac arrest in Aleppo, and he was buried there. But he said over his 17 years of direct experience over a period of 30 years, he said our past and present, meaning the Mormons in the Middle East, may be briefly told by counting up to 10. Thus, one lady missionary, Reba Booth, his spouse, was in the mission. 2 workers in the field today, himself and Reba. 3 cities have served as our headquarters. 4 elders, that's the term that Mormon missionaries have, male Mormon missionaries have as elder, that's their title, have died in the field, meaning died there in the Middle East. He was about to be the 5th. 5 nationalities have been baptized. 6 languages are needed to teach them. 7 apostles have been here. 8 cities now claim 1 or more of our members, and 9 out of 10 are in poverty. This is something that comes up continually in his journals, but not just his, but in the Mormon-Armenian, their family histories, their diaries and others, is the abject poverty that most of the Mormon-Armenian community experienced at this time. And there's for several reasons. It's encapsulated in the broader problems, economic crises of the Ottoman Empire during this time. There's a global, this is 1928, so there's obviously a global depression going on, but there was a global recession from the 1875 until 1900, basically, almost for 25 years. The same experiences that the broader Ottoman Armenian community were facing, particularly in central Anatolia, the poverty there, the Mormon Armenians were facing. On top of that, though, Mormon Armenians were also persecuted by their own communities. So they lost their jobs, they lost their employment, they lost their housing. Their kids could not go to Protestant schools or to the Armenian schools in the area. They are often persecuted, beaten. Even at one point, Joseph Booth and his then proselyting companion, Philip Maycock, were even stoned in Aintab on the first day of Lent in 1899 at that time by the broader Armenian community at that point in time. So, they didn't die, obviously, but it was pretty, there's just a lot of issues that they were facing. Poverty was a continual problem for them. So in Booth's journals from his, in 1899, he's talking about the poverty, and he continues to the whole time. And they do they make a lot of attempts to try to alleviate this poverty through creating their own types of Oriental rug manufacturing, very small kind of household manufacturing, household kind of types of, they're not factories, but handcrafts that are going on, to trying to even set up a Mormon colony at one point. Actually, that was a dream of Booth's the entire time, for the Armenian converts to be able to congregate to down in what is today, down in Palestine, Israel, or somewhere in the Levant. But this was a big problem that they faced, and this is something that comes up continually. And so it's important to understand what their situation was and the persecution that the Mormon Armenians themselves faced in what I'm calling this notion of compounding legal marginalization the entire time. And so I'm already getting into much of this. I'm going to explain compounding legal marginalization a little bit more. It's inspired and adapted from Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality. I've coined this phrase. It attempts to analyze how the convergence of factors in addition to race and gender, such as ethno-religious identity, class, nationalism, and citizenship, compound an already marginalized status of a particular group. Right? So this tries to take this further. It's heavily inspired by what Kimberly Crenshaw has written. If you're not familiar with her work, I highly recommend it. So the first missionaries, Mormon missionaries, to come into the Middle East, they got started later than, like, say, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, other Protestant missionaries. Mormons wouldn't consider themselves Protestants, but Western missionaries from the United States coming in as early as 1820, right? So they're not getting started until 64 years later when they first come in the 1880s and 1884. But Ferdinand Hinze, this guy here, he's credited as being the father of the Armenian mission. He was quite the character. I don't have time to go into too much detail about him, but I think it's important to note that he did a lot. He's the one that petitioned for millet status and was denied. He, with some others, translated the Book of Mormon into Armeno-Turkish and had it published and distributed in the Ottoman Empire at one point. He wasn't there at the time. Joseph Booth was. But they started systematically going there. They had to shut down the mission during the Hamidian massacres. They shut it down. The Western missionaries left. They came back in 1897 to reopen this, and they wanted to set up. This is when they first attempted to set up a Mormon colony in the area. Okay, the headquarters at this point in time were moved from Constantinople to Aintab, and in Aintab, they remained, the Mormon headquarters remained there until 1907, until they were moved to Aleppo. And I'm getting ahead of myself. So you had these branches of what the church calls branches. They're small congregations. This is in Zara in 1901, a photograph taken in 1901. That's not all the members of the branch, but there are several key families: the Sharinians, the Nazarians, the Gogoshians, the Pilavchians. These are all stalwart families, so to speak, in Zara at this point in time. This is Joseph Booth and Reba Booth early on in I think 1904 when they're there, and this is Booth in 1928, right? Time wasn't too kind to him, neither is it to any of us. So, the headquarters in Aintab, and then it was moved. This is taken in 1907 of the Aintab Sunday School, the Mormon Sunday School, and you can see the carpets they're showing off of where they're trying to produce those and sell those to the Mormon community in Utah as a cooperative type of situation. And then in Aleppo, right? This is it's a larger congregation than this. This is just the Sunday school, but this gives you some insights into the small communities that they have amidst larger cities like Aleppo and Aintab at this point. Right? The Armeno-Turkish Book of Mormon, published in 1905 out of Boston, and then brought into the Ottoman Empire in 1906, but then it was impounded until 1908. It wasn't allowed out by the Ottoman officials in Alexandretta at the time, even though it had been approved by officials in Istanbul and Constantinople. The local officials said, we're not going to let this out. The Mormons aren't recognized here. They don't have status here, type of a situation. So it was finally let out, though, with the Young Turk Revolution and the lifting of the sanctions and censorship stuff. This was finally released then. This was the most missionaries they had at any one time in the late Ottoman Empire. In 1909, when they finally had to close the mission again due to the violence of the Adana massacres and the instability of the Ottoman Empire at this point in time, because of the counter coup, also because of the Greek-Ottoman War of 1909. All sorts of things were causing problems or causing Salt Lake City to be concerned, and they pulled out all of the Western missionaries from there. And they didn't return until 1921 again. So you have the Mormon-Armenian population talking about their experience in World War I. This is the Ozunians, Mary and Reuben Ozunian and their family. That the First World War brought many horrors to the Armenian population. In this terrible time, all of the Aintab branch presidency, so the local leadership, they all killed. Roughly, I'm estimating between a third to half of the Mormon-Armenian community that remained here died as a result of the horrors of World War I. Right? At the end of the war, the surviving members returned to their country, meaning back to Aintab. The time was 1918, and more than 50 remaining members, all poor and hungry, used homes as their meeting places. During this time, there was little food and clothing for the members, and they experienced a terrible time. At times, the people had to eat the leaves of trees. Yeah, this is just a short excerpt from one of his short accounts. Right, at this time. In 1921, Joseph Booth came back as a Near East relief agent with a lot of supplies and money from the Mormon Church Utah. It shows a gradual acceptance of the Mormon Church within broader U.S. circles at this point in time. And in 1921, Booth came back in November to Aintab to find the rest of the remaining saints that Ozuzian was talking about, right? And decided that this was in the middle of the so-called Turkish War of Independence, what was going on at this point in time. You have former Ottoman troops and then Turkish nationalist troops fighting the French in what's called Galicia, Adana, that time period, right? Pushing them out. And threatening to continue the violence of the genocide of World War I. And so Booth talked to the French general at the time, got passports, visas for all of the remaining Aintab Mormon-Armenians and their extended families and others, and were able to do what they called a self-proclaimed exodus, like, thinking Moses, right, and the children of Israel, to Brigham Young and the Mormons going out to Utah, that type of situation. From Aintab to Aleppo in November of 1921. These are pictures of the Arabajalar, that the carriages and stuff that they set up. This is the French Lieutenant Guiton who helped them and accompanied them, and the caravan to Aleppo, where they combined the surviving branches in Aleppo, Syria, and the combined branches of Aleppo and Aintab in 1922. This is what you have. And so, Booth dies in 1928. The mission is shut down again, but is quickly reopened, and it continues. The Mormon mission in the Middle East continues after World War I, renamed as first the Armenian mission, and then it's renamed to the Palestine-Syrian mission, and then it's renamed to the Near East mission, and it finally closes in 1951. And most of those who are still in Aleppo, the Mormon-Armenians, they either immigrate to Lebanon, to Beirut, to Soviet Armenia, or to Utah, to the United States. And so, it's important to understand the broader LDS Armenian immigration experience. While it's it's notable for several reasons, right? First, it represents a severely modified continuation of the Mormon Church's what they called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. I don't know how many of you know Mormon history. I've learned a lot more than I ever thought I would with this project. And so, but I'll get to that in just a second. The Perpetual Immigration Fund, and notwithstanding its formal dissolution in 1887 Edmunds-Tucker Act, so the U.S. 1887 Edmunds-Tucker Act basically disincorporated the church, the Mormon Church, confiscated a lot of its properties, and then went about arresting most of its leaders, the male leadership, for practicing polygamy. It also then shut down its Perpetual Immigration Fund, which had a huge impact on settling the western United States, southern western Canada, and northern Mexico at this point in time. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but it's important that way because it shows us a switch in Mormon immigration practices at the time. Second, it also highlights the use and abuse of racialized public health practices, particularly related to the highly contagious eye disease trachoma, and how trachoma and this public health scares were deployed by immigration agents to target Syrian migrants, of which Armenians from the Ottoman Empire were considered at that time. Third, at the same time, public health concerns were applied in racialized ways. Their immigration experiences, Mormon-Armenian immigration experiences, also demonstrated change in Armenian and Mormon-Armenian status according to U.S. immigration practices. Fourth, these immigration experiences also highlight continued Ottoman imperial discrimination, targeting Armenian immigrants to the United States. And finally, these experiences also demonstrate the precarious status of Mormon-Armenians and their missionaries in the late Ottoman Empire in terms of their treatment by Ottoman officials, Protestant missionaries, and the broader Armenian community. So I want to talk a little bit about a little bit more about compounding marginalization. And one of the things is that since the 1850s, the U.S. Congress and various state officials in the United States severely persecuted Mormons for their open practice of polygamy. In fact, the famous goal of congressional leaders at the time, in the 1850s, was to stamp out, quote, the twin pillars of barbarism, slavery and polygamy, close quote. According to legalized racial practices, Mormons were actually categorized in the United States as degenerate white and Asiatic. And an 1879 circular written by U.S. Secretary of State William Everett was sent to all U.S. consulates and embassies instructing U.S. officials to enlist their consular counterparts to, quote, harass, monitor, and prevent Mormon agents, i.e. missionaries, from proselyting in their countries because they were part of a criminal network to enslave women into their harems. This circular also urged foreign governments to prevent Mormon converts from immigrating or traveling to the United States. There's clear evidence that the Everett Circular prejudiced Ottoman officials against Mormon proselyting activities at the time because it was brought up. Mormons aren't known to us. They live like wild animals. Rarely do their children know their fathers. All of these types of things Booth was told by different Ottoman officials, and he wrote them down, these types of situations. It's also interesting, though, that many local Ottoman officials talked about Mormons having no rights because they're not known to the Ottoman government. They're not recognized also. You have, following the Everett Circular, the United States government then disincorporated the LDS Church, as I said, with the 1887 Edmunds-Tucker Act, confiscated much of its properties, and arrested its leaders for practicing polygamy. This act effectively shut down most Mormon immigration to the U.S. by defunding the Church's Perpetual Immigration Fund, which is arguably one of the most successful private immigration funds in the history of the United States, having brought tens of thousands of mostly Western European Mormon converts to the Mountain West Great Basin region and fueled Mormon colonization efforts across the Western United States. And you can see some of these there's Mormon colonies that still exist to this day in northern Mexico. You have southern Alberta, Canada, that were settled by a lot of Mormon settlements, and obviously much of the Western United States with, this is why Mesa, Arizona has so many Mormons in it. This is why places like Kalispell, Wyoming, no, that's Montana, Green River, Wyoming, others have these large Mormon communities in them. It's because of, as the Mormon practice of what they called gathering to Zion to their converts. Come to the United States, we'll help pay for your passage over, you pay it back, we'll give you a loan, and then we'll settle you in these other areas around, obviously displacing Native Americans in the process, but also creating a lot of white settlements at this point in time out in these areas. And so you have the 1891 Immigration Act, while seen mainly as legislation to prevent Chinese and South Asian immigration to the U.S., also prohibited polygamists from entering the United States. So it was geared directly at Mormons too. At this way, they couldn't. In the law, they couldn't say you can't let Mormons in because they're citizens. Many of them are citizens of the United States, but you can say those who practice polygamy, which was targeted at Mormons. They were the main people practicing polygamy in the United States at that point. At the same time that the United States legislated against Mormons, the Ottoman government attempted to legislate against Armenians in terms of immigration and movement, particularly regarding their internal movement and their ability to immigrate abroad to the United States. David Gutman, as I said, has extensively documented these attempted restrictions and their failures during the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and the Second Constitutional Period. As tensions between Armenian advocates for autonomy and rights under Ottoman rule increased, the state's fear of Armenian revolutionary activity and insurrection also rose. First, the Ottoman government enacted the Murir Tezkeresi system that attempted to restrict Armenian movement within the empire without much success. But eventually, the government developed a policy of terki tabiyet, where Armenians who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. had to renounce their Ottoman citizenship and vow to never return to the empire again. Additionally, the Ottoman ambassador to the United States, Alexandros Mavroieni, who is a Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian Ottoman official, actively worked to spy on Armenians in the U.S. who had immigrated from the Ottoman Empire. He even employed the infamous Pinkerton Detective Agency to infiltrate Armenian revolutionary meetings in the Boston area. These two immigration restrictions by the United States and the Ottoman state compounded against Mormon missionaries and their Armenian converts. And Booth talks about the problems he had trying to get his tezkeresi renewed, just his ability to move around. They didn't want him to have Mormon on his identity card. Why don't you just put Christian? He's like, I'm not, I'm a Mormon. These types of situations, he always had these arguments with folks about it. What I want to get into now is actually some of the Mormon Armenians, their own immigration experiences. Not a lot of, when it's roughly, I'm estimating at this point, I have to do a lot more detailed kind of combing through, but it's about 100 Armenian Mormons that immigrated to the United States. But you still see them throughout Utah and these other areas with their very easily identifiable Armenian names of Uzunian, Shirinian, Aposhian, Shilhagopian. They changed their name to Jacobs. It was just easier, I guess, for them when they're going through here. But these notions of what their experiences were, they're still around. And as I've been working in the Mormon Church archives, the special collections at Brigham Young University, I keep running into people who say, yeah, I'm 1/12 Armenian, my great, we go through the Shirinian line, or these types of things. Their immigration experience is pretty similar to a lot in the United States. First generation, they stay kind of insulated within themselves. Their kids go to school, they learn English, they intermarry, they go on, and they kind of settle. But their Armenian identity is still very strong to them, that I found at least in Utah as well. These various degrees of compounding marginalization that I've talked about are most clearly manifest in the immigration experiences of the Mormon-Armenians from the Ottoman Empire to the United States. Very few of them were able to take advantage of the Perpetual Immigration Fund because it was outlawed by 1887. The missionaries had only been in there since 1884. There weren't that many converts at the point in time. But you still had this practice of Mormon missionaries saying, gather to Zion. That would help them out. There was still some financial support, but not what it used to be for this. And so you have, I don't know if you can call a few families waves, right, of immigration, but you have kind of some distinct experiences. There's only two that I found that were able to do the trans-hemispheric migrations, right, moving around. This was Armeneg Shil Hagopian and Hagop Gagosian. Hagop Gagosian is from the Zara branch in Sivas. Armeneg Shil Hagopian is from Aleppo, from Haleb, okay, that area. Armeneg was a doctor, medical doctor. He was sent by the Ottoman state to go to Louisville College of Medicine in Kentucky. He had converted to Mormonism in 1892, kept it quiet, told nobody, went over to the Louisville, Kentucky College of Medicine, and then while he was there for a couple of years, he took a trip to Salt Lake City and met with the Mormon prophet at the time, Wilford Woodruff, who had just issued the proclamation forbidding Mormons to practice polygamy anymore, and that set it up for the Utah to become a state in 1896, these types of things. But he talked to Wilford Woodruff about, should we immigrate? Should I bring my whole family over? He's like, no, build up what they called Zion there. Build up the church, build up the kingdom of God. This is Mormon parlance here. There, where you're at. So he returned. He was a military doctor. So he was able to return, and this was all above board at this point in time for the Ottoman state, right? It wasn't the same situation as other Armenians who were sneaking out of the Ottoman Empire and then sneaking back in type of a situation. He came with state support, so to speak. So his was a unique case. This doesn't represent. Hagop Gagosian is more of the similar case. He was part of the Hunjaks before he converted to Mormonism and decided that he had to leave the revolutionary life because it wasn't compatible with his new faith. His cell put out a death warrant on him, and he had to flee. And so he fled to the United States, went to Utah, was eventually there, didn't even tell his family that he left. He was a plasterer, that's what he did as his work. And he came back in 1897 with, I showed you this quick picture. Sorry, I'm not trying to make your eyes bug out. But he came back with this group, Anthon Lund and Hinsey, in 1897, and was able to sneak back in with false identity papers and those types of things. And his was very similar to a lot of transmigration activities. But those two were the great exception. Most of the families, their experiences, such as this is more of Armeneg and Osana Shil Hagopian. Osana was a Bagdonian from their family. Armeneg got mobilized in 1912 for the first Balkan War and died of cholera. Right? Osana died in 1909 after 2 years of long illness, and they had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Only one of the girls survived. They survived their parents, but their experience was basically you had Henry and Enos, who were the younger brothers, along with their younger sister Mary, that after Armeneg and Osana died, they were given to their maternal grandparents, right? Their maternal grandparents died in the genocide. These three ended up in an orphanage in Beirut, and then eventually tried to make their way to the United States. Mary went to Boston with her maternal grandmother's family, that extended side of the family. She never converted to Mormonism, but Henry and Enos, and then Carl and Joseph, the other two, Carl and Joseph, they did, and they all made their own ways to Utah eventually. Enos had the hardest time because he was actually caught at the border and sent back, and he had deportation orders against him for many years. They were sent back to Lebanon. He and his brother tried to get in through Guatemala into the United States in like 1926, and they were turned back. And they were finally reunited in 1956 when Enos was able to get his deportation order lifted, right? And they were all in Utah in 1956. This is from the local newspaper talking about the Jacobs family reunion type of a situation. Whereas Carl and Joseph, they immigrated in 1910 and 1912, respectively, at age 17 to avoid the military draft, the Ottoman military draft at that point in time. And their situation was went all over the place. Carl, or Corin was his name, he went first to Egypt for 3 years and worked there in a tobacco mill and other places, and then made his way through France to Boston with help from his extended family, his mother's side of the family, the Bagdoyans. And Joseph made a similar way. He was a couple of years later, 2 years later in 1912. They both settled in Boston at first and then eventually made their way out to Utah. Right? So it's just, you have these, this is a little more representative of examples in the post-genocide era of families trying to reunite in the United States post-genocide. Mary settled in Boston, married her husband Lavan, and kept her Shilhagopian last name. Kept it, didn't change it to Jacobs like her brothers did. They all did eventually. Another family I want to give the example of this is more representative of what the Mormon-Armenian experience was. This is the Tavoyan family, circa 1928. This picture was taken when they were all in Utah. In 1906, Arzuman and Ajibe, they took themselves and their 5 daughters, the hairstyles back then, and amazing. Their 5 daughters, their 2 youngest children were born at that point in time, obviously in 1906, and left. They're in Zara. They left and first had to go take out their Tarki Tabiat, renounce their Ottoman citizenship, get their photographs taken, that whole process. They then went to Samsun on the Black Sea coast, hopped a boat, went to Constantinople, and then to Athens. From Athens, they went to Naples. And in Naples, they had their health inspections happened. And Ajibe and one of their daughters, I'm forgetting which one, said they had the trachoma, they had the eye disease, right? And they were told to split up the healthy ones. Arzuman and the 4 daughters that were healthy would go on, and Ajibe and their other daughter would stay behind, and they weren't having it. They weren't going to split up the family. So they were told by a stranger, go to Alexandria, Egypt. The Armenian community there will help you out. And so they went from Naples down to Alexandria in Egypt, and they were able to get some support from the Armenian church there. You can hide if you're Mormon, right? If you're Armenian, you can hide that you're Mormon. But it came out somehow that they were Mormon, and then they were cut off. They didn't get the financial assistance from the Armenian community there was cut off, but they were allowed to stay in the room that was letted out to them. Eventually, it took 2 years for Ajibe to get a clean bill of health. They tried this again. They went back up through Naples, rejected again. And then they spent the next 2 years after that in Athens until Ajibe was able to get a clean bill of health again, and they eventually made their way. By 1910, they finally got to Utah. But it took them 4 years of this process going through here because of the health regulations, right? Because of their Asiatic and their Mormon-Armenian experience, how it limited and characterized their abilities. They couldn't take advantage of the same types of support systems that were so well developed for the broader Armenian communities in terms of migrations at that point in time. Another wonderful family example are three families that immigrated, about 19 people that immigrated at the same time: the Palavchian family, the Aposhian family, and the Aurelian family. The Aurelians were from Aintab. The Aposhian and Palavchia were from Zara. Okay, they went through this very similar process. They went. The Aposhian and Palavchian family went to Sivas, the provincial capital, renounced their citizenship, got their Terki Tebiat. We're going to join the Aurelian family in Aintab and then go together. Joseph Booth was going to accompany him along with, I can't remember his first name, this is Elder Shepherd, one of the young missionary elders at the time, accompanying them. This was taken in Liverpool or in London, one of those two places, by the time they made it. But what happened was the Palavchians and the Aposhians were arrested as they were going down to Aintab and thrown in prison. Booth had to try and get them out, petitioned the local governors to get them out. Eventually they got them out. They tried to sell their goods and to leave. They were harassed and held up, and their stuff was stolen from them by the local Armenian community, then by bandits along the road, along the way. All sorts of interesting things. They got from Aintab, finally got to Beirut, then from there eventually made their way through Marseille to Liverpool. And when they got to Liverpool, this is 1908, they were needing some help and assistance. And the Mormon leader of the European mission at that time, his name was Penrose, President Penrose, said, "No, we're not doing this anymore. Go back to where you came from. We're not going to help you." Even though Booth was of the understanding with his correspondence back and forth that yes, they were going to get some assistance along the way. At the same time that they're in London finally here in 1908, Liverpool, and then to London, Booth meets up with Arzuman Tavoyan, who also tries to go there to get help from Penrose. And Penrose says he's very Orientalist, very racist. You go back to where you came from, basically situation at this point in time. And so you have internal problems and discrimination among different Mormon leaders against the Asiatic Mormons, as sometimes they would be referred to. But their experience finally in Liverpool, they were able to scrape the money together. These three families, they're not all represented in this picture, but this is what I have of them. Went through the medical checks. The Aposhian family, the matriarch of the Aposhian family, was deemed with trachoma, even though that's not what she had at the time. She was clear, but they found something, and they said that she had to be held behind. While her first three children who had passed the inspection were already on the boat, and so were the Aurelian and the Palavchian family. They had already passed it, and the boat left without them. So they had three of their children with other families on the boat, and the rest of the family behind was like, well, how do we don't know where they're going. They got on the next boat. That after a couple of days, once they got the clean bill of health and they were able to petition the situation, they thought they were getting on a boat to New York, the Aposhians, the remaining of the family. They ended up in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And they eventually got out to Utah, like right around Thanksgiving, right, of 1908. And then once they got to Quebec, they found out where the other ship had gone, and it was Tampico, Mexico. And let's see if I can get I have a good here. So think about it. They're coming, first of all, from Zara down to Aintab to Beirut, out through this area. They go up to Marseille, and then from Marseille they go around to Liverpool. The families get caught up. One goes down to Tampico, Mexico, which is on the Yucatan Peninsula, and then others are going up to Quebec, Canada. The Aposhian family, without their three kids, eventually are able to get to Utah, and then the other families and the kids are transported from Tampico up to the Mormon colonies that are in southern and northern Mexico at the time. The children are farmed out to other Mormon families there. They're working as laborers, as domestic servants. The Aposhian family's trying to get their kids back. They're sending money. The family that they're working for, the matriarch of that family is confiscating the money, not telling the kids about the money. It wants to keep them in an indentured types of quasi-slavery status. They're finally able to get the money. The Aposhians finally are able to get their kids the money, and the Aurelian family and the Plavchian family, and they're able. The immigration records show them crossing the border at El Paso, Texas, coming into Utah, and they're able to get there by December, near Christmas time, 19. Later than that. It was about 3 months later, in 1909, early 1909. But that just kind of gives you an encapsulation of what their experiences were and how they were going all over the place to try and get here, and how they weren't able to have these same, avail themselves to the same types of protections sometimes that the broader Armenian communities were. It also gives us insights. I've been often asked, well, if things were so bad, if 9 out of 10 are in poverty, then why would they convert to Mormonism? And it's a great question. It's a great question, right? As historians, we have a hard time taking belief seriously. Because how do we measure that? How do we measure someone's faith? These types of things. And if they're not getting all these huge material benefits because there's all these issues in front of them, how do we account for it? You know, in some ways there's some support, there is some help, there's community. But when you read the Mormon-Armenian converts, their family histories, they all talk about their conversions. And sometimes it's a dream they have. Joseph Smith appears to them or something like that in a dream, a vision, a strong, some type of moving feeling that tells them. And at some point, these folks gave up a lot to do this. At some point, you have to take their faith seriously. I'm just not sure how we can measure that empirically as historians, but I don't know if we always have to either. I like a multivariate explanation for things. So it can be financial, it can be material, it can be social support, it can be religious belief as well. Maybe we ought to try and take that seriously as well. Thanks very much.